The rain fell in sheets, blurring the world outside the polished windows of the Maybach into a watercolor wash of gray and neon. Inside, the silence was absolute, a pressurized cocoon of chilled air and the scent of expensive leather. Arthur Vance, a man whose face was more familiar to the readers of Forbes than to his own reflection, held a phone to his ear, his voice a low, precise instrument of command. No, Marcus. Postponement is not an option. Tell Fletcher, if he can't handle the pressure, he should have stayed in acquisitions. This merger is the culmination of 5 years of work. It will proceed on Friday, with or without his blessing. He listened for a moment, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching just below his temple. The traffic was at a standstill, a river of red lights pooling on the slick asphalt of Fifth Avenue. He pinched the bridge of his nose. The headache that had been his constant companion for the past year, threatening to bloom behind his eyes. He hated this city in the rain. It reminded him of the day Eleanor. He cut the thought off, a brutal act of mental self-preservation. Glancing out the window, his eyes scanned the bedraggled pedestrians hurrying under a canopy of umbrellas. Then he saw her, a small figure huddled under the flimsy awning of a closed newsstand, a splash of defiant yellow in a world of monochrome. A little girl, no older than 7, with hair the color of wet straw. She stood behind a rickety card table, its surface arrayed with a pathetic collection of mismatched toys and cheap jewelry. It was a sight he'd normally filter out, another piece of the city's unfortunate scenery. But then a stray sunbeam, breaking through a momentary gap in the oppressive clouds, struck something on her chest. A glint of gold. Not just any gold. It was a locket, a perfect, custom-made disc of it, intricately engraved, with the swirling, interlocking dance of a sun and a moon. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful hitch. He had designed that locket himself, sketched it on a cocktail napkin on their honeymoon in Santorini, a symbol of them, he, the pragmatic sun, she, his ethereal moon. It was one of a kind. It was Eleanor's. And it was currently hanging around the neck of a street urchin, nestled between a plastic dinosaur and a chipped ceramic mug. Arthur's world tilted on its axis. The voice of his business partner, Marcus, buzzed forgotten in his ear. Arthur, Arthur, are you there? With a convulsive movement, Arthur ended the call, his thumb jabbing the screen. Stop the car, he commanded, his voice raspy, alien to his own ears. His driver, a stoic man named Peterson, who had been with him for a decade, glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Sir, we're in the middle of the street. I said, stop the car, now. The command was laced with a raw, serrated edge that Peterson had never heard before. The limousine glided to an abrupt halt, earning a chorus of angry honks from the cars behind them. Without a word, Arthur pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold, driving rain, his bespoke Italian suit instantly darkening with moisture. He didn't feel the chill. He didn't hear the cacophony of the city. His entire universe had contracted to that single point of impossible, brilliant gold. He strode toward the newsstand, each step a hammer blow on the pavement, his 6'2" frame an intimidating silhouette against the traffic's glare. The little girl looked up as he approached, her eyes the color of a stormy sea, widening in alarm. She clutched the locket instinctively, her small hand covering the familiar design. The sight of her grubby fingers on Eleanor's locket sent a fresh wave of rage and grief through him, so potent it made him dizzy. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. His voice was a low growl, stripped of its usual boardroom polish. The girl shrank back, pressing herself against the cold metal of the newsstand. She said nothing, her lower lip trembling. "I asked you a question," Arthur pressed, leaning over the pathetic table, his shadow engulfing her. "That locket. Where did you get it?" He was aware, on some distant level, of people staring, of the absurdity of the scene. A man in a $1,000 suit menacing a small child over a piece of jewelry. He didn't care. That locket was a sacred relic, the last piece of Eleanor he had held before they closed the casket. It had been buried with her. At least, that's what he had believed. Had some ghoul robbed her grave? Had some orderly stolen it from her in her final moments? The possibilities were monstrous, each one more agonizing than the last. "Please, mister," the girl finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "It's not for sale." Not for sale. The absurdity of her words was a slap in the face. "Everything is for sale," he snarled, pulling his wallet from his jacket. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. "How much? $100? $500?" He threw a fan of crisp bills onto the table, the money landing with a soft thud next to a headless Barbie doll. The girl stared at the money, then back up at him, her expression a mixture of terror and confusion. "No," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "It's mine. It was a gift." A gift. The word echoed in the hollow space where his heart used to be. A profound, unreasoning fury took hold of him. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched. "Give it to me." The girl scrambled backward, a small cry escaping her lips. Just as his fingers were about to close around the delicate gold chain, another figure darted into the scene. "Hey! Get away from my daughter!" A woman, drenched and breathless, shoved herself between Arthur and the child. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with the same stormy gray eyes as the girl, and a face etched with a weary sort of prettiness. She was wearing nurse's scrubs under a thin, worn-out jacket. She wrapped a protective arm around her daughter, pulling the child behind her. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a potent cocktail of fear and righteous anger. Arthur straightened up, his gaze shifting from the locket to the woman. "That necklace your daughter is wearing," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "It belongs to me. It was stolen." The woman's eyes blazed. "Stolen? Are you insane? Lily would never steal anything in her life." She looked down at her daughter, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Lily, honey, go wait by the donut shop. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be right there." The little girl, Lily, hesitated, her gaze flicking between her mother and the menacing stranger. "But Mama!" "Now, Lily!" The command was sharp, leaving no room for argument. With one last frightened glance, Lily scurried away, her small form disappearing into the crowd. The woman turned back to Arthur, her entire body language a declaration of war. "Now, you listen to me. I don't know who you are or what kind of sick game you're playing, but you will not bully my child." "I am not playing a game," Arthur said, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He felt a strange sense of unreality, as if he were watching himself in a film. "That locket belonged to my wife. My late wife." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps even pity, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a hardened skepticism. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her tone formal and unconvinced. "But you're mistaken. That locket was given to my daughter." "By whom?" Arthur shot back. "Who would give a child a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry worth more than your entire apartment?" The insult was low and deliberate, born of his pain, but he saw it land. A flush crept up her neck. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And you certainly don't know anything about the kind woman who gave that to my Lily." "Tell me her name," Arthur demanded. "This kind woman. Tell me who she was." The woman hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "Her name was Ellie. She was a patient at the hospice, where I work sometimes. She and Lily, they became friends." Ellie! Eleanor had sometimes gone by Ellie with her closest friends. A cold dread, heavier and more chilling than the rain, began to seep into Arthur's bones. This was impossible. Eleanor had been so weak in those final months, barely conscious most of the time. He had been there every day, managing his empire from her bedside, his laptop a shield against the unbearable reality of her decline. He would have known if she'd formed some deep friendship with a nurse and her child. He would have known. "That's a lie," he said, the words tasting like ash. "My wife was in a private room. She had round-the-clock care. No one got in to see her without my express permission." "Maybe you weren't as in control as you thought," the woman retorted, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Ellie was lonely. She liked Lily's stories. She said Lily's laugh was the only real music she had heard in months." Each word was a tiny, sharp blade, piercing the armor of denial he had so carefully constructed around himself. Lonely. His Eleanor. Lonely. Surrounded by the best medical care money could buy, in a room filled with flowers he had sent every morning. The accusation was absurd. He looked past the woman, at the city throbbing with life, a life that had stolen Eleanor from him. He felt a surge of raw, untethered desperation. He needed that locket. It felt like, if he could just hold it, he could somehow hold on to her. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Name your price." He was back on familiar ground now. Money was a language he understood, a tool he could wield with absolute confidence. "I'm not selling my daughter's property," she said through gritted teeth. "And I'm not selling my integrity. Now please, leave us alone." "I'm not leaving without it." His stubbornness was a fortress. It had built him an empire. It had also, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind, built a wall between him and his wife long before she got sick. He ignored it. "Then I guess you'll be standing here for a long time," she said. She turned to walk away, to follow her daughter. In a moment of sheer, unthinking panic, Arthur reached out and grabbed her arm. It was a mistake. He knew it the instant his fingers closed around her thin wrist. Her skin was cold and damp. She froze, her body going rigid. She turned her head slowly, her gray eyes locking onto his with an intensity that startled him. "Let go of me." The words were spoken softly, but they carried more menace than a shout. He released her arm as if he'd been burned. A red mark was already forming on her pale skin. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes now, and for the first time a sliver of shame pierced his rage. What was he doing? What kind of man had he become? Before he could say anything, to apologize, or to threaten, she turned and fled, running down the slick sidewalk, not looking back. Arthur stood there, alone in the rain. The sound of the city's horns, a distant, mocking lament. He watched until she was gone. a small, defiant figure swallowed by the uncaring metropolis. His limousine was still idling a few feet away, a silent, reproachful witness. Peterson stood by the open door, holding an umbrella, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Arthur walked back to the car, his movements stiff and robotic. He got in, sinking into the plush leather seat, the door closing with a soft, final thud, sealing him back inside his silent, luxurious prison. He was soaked to the bone, but the chill he felt was deep within him, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He had just terrorized a child and assaulted her mother. He had offered money for a memory and threatened when it was refused. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had built a global corporation from nothing. They were trembling. He had lost. He had confronted the ghost of his wife on a rainy street corner, and he had lost. But this was not over. He was Arthur Vance. He did not lose. He would find them, and he would get that locket back. It was his. It had always been his. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. The city lights smeared across the windows like garish, wet paint. Arthur stared out at them, unseeing. The image of the little girl's terrified face was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The feel of the woman's fragile wrist in his hand was a brand on his skin. He had acted like a thug, a common bully. The thought was galling. He was a man who solved problems with intellect and strategy, who moved markets with a single phone call. He didn't engage in tawdry public spectacles. Yet he had, because of a piece of gold, because of Eleanor. When he arrived at his building, a sleek glass and steel monolith that scraped the sky over Central Park, he bypassed the private elevator and went straight to his office on the 50th floor, leaving a trail of damp footprints on the polished marble floors. His office was a testament to his success, a cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city. But tonight, the view felt like a mockery. The city was a glittering, indifferent beast that had devoured his happiness. He went straight to the bar, a minimalist slab of black granite, and poured himself a generous measure of Macallan 25. He didn't savor it. He drank it like medicine, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the ice in his veins. He sat down at his massive desk, its surface usually covered with financial reports and deal memos, now starkly empty. He swiveled his chair to face the window. Below, the traffic flowed like rivers of light, each one a life, a story, a world unto itself. In one of those cars, or one of those apartments, was a woman and a child who held the key to a mystery he couldn't comprehend. He took another long swallow of scotch. He had to think. Emotion was a liability. He needed a plan, a strategy. First, he needed information. Who were they? Where did they live? The woman wore scrubs. She'd mentioned a hospice. That was a start. New York City had hundreds of hospices. It was a needle in a haystack. But he had the resources to find it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. The man who answered on the second ring had a voice like gravel. "Gavin." "Mr. Vance," Gavin replied, his tone respectful but unsurprised by the late-night call. Gavin was his head of security, a former Mossad agent who handled Arthur's more delicate problems. "I need you to find someone for me," Arthur said, his voice flat. "A woman and her daughter. The girl's name is Lily. She's about 7. The mother is in her late 20s, gray eyes, wears nurse's scrubs. They were on the corner of 5th and 57th, around 4 p.m. today." "Do you have a name for the mother?" Gavin asked. "No," Arthur admitted, a fresh spike of irritation rising in him. He hadn't even thought to ask. But the girl was selling trinkets at a card table. The woman said she works at a hospice. Find her. It's a big city, Mr. Vance. And I pay you a small fortune to make it smaller, Gavin. Check traffic cameras, facial recognition databases, canvass the area. I want a name and an address on my desk by morning. Understood. The line went dead. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing under his weight. He felt a sliver of his usual control returning. This was what he did. He identified a problem, and he deployed resources to solve it. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a market fluctuation. This was something else. It was messy. It was personal. He closed his eyes, and Eleanor's face swam into his vision. Not the frail, faded version from the end, but the vibrant, laughing Eleanor from their early years. Her, with paint smeared on her cheek in the small art studio she'd kept before they got too important for such hobbies. Her, dancing barefoot in the kitchen of their first apartment. Her eyes sparkling with a light that could have powered the entire city. That light had been extinguished, and he, in his relentless pursuit of more money, more power, more success, had barely noticed it dimming. He'd told himself he was building a kingdom for her, but in reality he had built a gilded cage, and then a sterile, lonely sick room. The woman's words came back to him. Ellie was lonely. He opened his eyes, the pain in his chest so sharp he felt like he was having a heart attack. He stood up and began to pace the length of his office, the city lights spinning around him. He had to get that locket back. It was more than just jewelry. It was a tangible piece of his past, a symbol of a love he had failed to honor. It was his last chance at some kind of redemption. But as he paced, a more insidious thought began to creep in. What if the woman was telling the truth? What if Eleanor, in her final days, had found solace not with him, the husband who sat by her bed staring at stock tickers, but with a stranger and her little girl? What if she had willingly given away the one thing that symbolized their love? The thought was unbearable, a betrayal that cut deeper than any corporate espionage. It would mean that in the end, he hadn't known his wife at all. The scotch was doing nothing. He walked over to his desk and opened a drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of old contracts, was a velvet-lined box. He opened it. It contained the matching locket, the one he wore, the sun to her moon. He hadn't opened it since the funeral. With trembling fingers, he undid the clasp. Inside, on one half, was a tiny, perfectly rendered photograph of Eleanor on their wedding day. On the other half, engraved in his own handwriting, were the words Solus et Lunae, Semper, sun and moon, always. He snapped it shut. He would find them. He would get the truth. And he would reclaim what was his. The cost was irrelevant. The next morning, Arthur was in his office before the sun had even begun to tint the eastern sky. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at the city, his mind a relentless loop of the confrontation, of Eleanor's face, of the little girl's wide, frightened eyes. A single email sat in his inbox. It was from Gavin. Subject, file attached. Arthur opened it. There were two photographs. The first was a grainy screen grab from a traffic camera showing the woman shielding the girl. The second was a clearer photo, obviously a DMV license picture. Her name was Sarah Jennings. The file contained her address, an apartment building in a rundown part of Queens, her date of birth, her nursing license details, and her employment history. She was a per diem nurse. not attached to any single hospital, picking up shifts where she could. It was a life lived on the margins, a world away from his own. The file also listed the name of the hospice she'd worked at most recently, St. Jude's Hospice Care, a small charity-run facility in the Bronx, a place Eleanor should never have been near. She had been at the prestigious, private Mount Sinai Palliative Care Center. He was sure of it. He'd written the checks himself. He pulled up Eleanor's medical records on his secure server. There it was. Admitted to Mount Sinai, August 10th. Discharged. He stopped. The discharge date was 2 weeks before her death. Where had she been for those last 2 weeks? He frantically searched for a transfer record, a new admission file. There was nothing. It was as if she had vanished from the system. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He had been in Hong Kong for those 2 weeks, closing the biggest deal of his career. He'd called her room every day, but the nurses had said she was sleeping or heavily sedated. He'd accepted their explanations, relieved to be shielded from the grim realities, focused on the deal he'd told himself was for her, for their future, a future she wouldn't even have. Had she been moved? Had she discharged herself? The idea was preposterous. She could barely lift her head. He buzzed his assistant. "Cancel my morning, all of it." "But, Mr. Vance, the board meeting—" "Cancel it," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. He grabbed his coat. He was going to Queens. He needed to see this woman, Sarah Jennings, again. But this time, it would be on his terms. He would be calm. He would be rational. He would not be the monster he had been in the rain. The building was even grimmer than he had imagined. A 5-story brick walk-up, its facade stained with years of city grime. The lobby smelled of stale cabbage and damp concrete. Sarah Jennings lived in apartment 4B. Arthur took the stairs, his expensive shoes echoing on the worn linoleum. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had stepped into a different dimension. When he reached her door, he hesitated. What was he going to say? "I'm sorry I assaulted you. Now give me my dead wife's locket." He raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could make contact, the door opened. Sarah stood there, holding a half-full garbage bag. She was dressed in jeans and a faded t-shirt. She froze when she saw him, her eyes widening in disbelief and fear. The garbage bag slipped from her fingers, its contents, empty milk cartons, coffee grounds, eggshells, spilling onto the floor. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She instinctively tried to slam the door, but Arthur was quicker, placing his hand flat against the wood. "Please," he said, and the word sounded strange coming from him, stripped of its usual authority. "Please don't. I just want to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You need to leave. I'll call the police." "Go ahead," he said, surprising himself with his own sincerity. "They can't arrest me for standing in a hallway." "Sarah. Your name is Sarah Jennings. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to understand." The use of her name seemed to throw her off balance. She stared at him, her mind clearly racing. How did he know her name? How did he find her? How? "I have resources," he said simply. "I apologize for my behavior yesterday. It was inexcusable. I was not myself." From inside the apartment, a small voice called out, "Mama, who is it?" Sarah's expression hardened again. She pushed against the door. "You are not coming in here." "I'm not asking to," Arthur said, holding his ground. "Just give me 5 minutes, Please, let me explain why that locket is so important." He saw the conflict in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was warring with something else. Curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of compassion. She was a nurse, after all. Her life was built around caring for people, even difficult ones. "Wait here," she said finally. Her voice clipped. She closed the door, leaving him alone in the dingy hallway with the spilled garbage. He could hear her muffled voice inside, speaking to her daughter in soft, reassuring tones. A few moments later, the door opened again, just a crack. "5 minutes," she said, stepping out into the hallway and pulling the door closed behind her. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms over her chest, a posture that was both defensive and weary. "Talk." Arthur took a deep breath. He had commanded boardrooms of hostile executives, addressed stadiums filled with shareholders. But standing in this dim, smelly hallway, facing this tired-looking young woman, he felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. "The locket," he began, his voice quieter than he intended. "I designed it for my wife, Eleanor, for our first anniversary. It's one of a kind. The engravings, the clasp, the secret compartment. It's all my design. It was her most treasured possession." He paused, but Sarah's expression remained guarded, unreadable. "She was buried with it. Or so I thought. When I saw your daughter wearing it yesterday, I lost my mind. I thought her grave had been robbed, or that someone at the hospital had stolen it. The worst possible scenarios. So you decided to take it out on a 7-year-old girl," Sarah said, her voice flat, accusatory. Arthur flinched. "Yes," he admitted. "And I am deeply, profoundly sorry for that. There is no excuse. I was overwhelmed by grief, and I behaved like a monster. I hope you and your daughter can forgive me." His apology, raw and genuine, seemed to disarm her slightly. The hard line of her mouth softened. "She told me your wife's name was Ellie," Sarah said quietly. "The woman who gave her the locket. She was a patient at St. Jude's Hospice." "That's what I don't understand," Arthur said, leaning forward slightly, his voice filled with a desperate need for answers. "My wife was at Mount Sinai. She was never at St. Jude's." Sarah frowned, a genuine confusion on her face. "But she was, for the last 2 weeks of her life. She was in room 301. I was her primary nurse for the evening shift. Room 301. The number meant nothing to him, but the certainty in Sarah's voice was undeniable. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "I was paying for the best private care in the city. Why would she be in a charity hospice in the Bronx?" "Maybe you should ask yourself that," Sarah said, her tone sharpening again. "Maybe she didn't want to be in a fancy room where her husband managed his stock portfolio while she was dying. Maybe she wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere real." The words were a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered those last 2 weeks, the sterile quiet of her room at Mount Sinai, the constant beeping of machines. He had hated it. He had assumed she did too. But he had never asked. He had been too busy, too important, too afraid. "She checked herself out of Mount Sinai," Sarah continued, her voice softening as she saw the genuine shock and pain on his face. "She had a friend, another patient, who was being transferred to St. Jude's. She heard they had a garden. She said she wanted to see flowers again. Real flowers, not the ones in vases that were changed every day, whether they were dead or not." A garden. He remembered the small, wild garden Eleanor had cultivated on the terrace of their first apartment. It had been her sanctuary. The terrace of their penthouse was a sterile, architect-designed space with a few perfectly manicured shrubs. There was no garden. She was a lovely woman, Sarah said, her gaze distant, lost in memory. Quiet, but with a wicked sense of humor. She used to call the IV stand her boyfriend, because it was always with her. She talked about you. Arthur's head snapped up. What did she say? She said you were a brilliant man, Sarah said carefully, that you had built an empire from nothing, and that you had forgotten how to see the moon, because you were so focused on conquering the sun. The metaphor was so quintessentially Eleanor that it felt like she was standing there in the hallway with them. Solus et lunae, sun and moon. She loved Lily, Sarah went on. My daughter, she's a special kid. She's not afraid of things that scare most people. She would sneak into Ellie's room and read her stories. She'd tell her about her day at school, about the scraped knee, about the boy who pulled her hair. Silly, childish things. But Ellie would listen with this incredible focus, like it was the most important news in the world. She said Lily's voice was like a wind chime. Arthur could picture it. He could see this small, bright girl cutting through the sterile fog of illness and impending death. A tiny, vibrant spark of life. A spark he had failed to provide. The locket, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Why did she give it to her? It was the day before. Sarah trailed off, unable to say the word. Lily had come to visit. Ellie was weak, very weak. She took off the locket and put it around Lily's neck. She told her, every time you look at this, I want you to remember that even on the darkest night, there is always a moon. And even on the cloudiest day, the sun is still shining. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't have both. She looked Arthur directly in the eye. Then she said, and when you're older, if you ever meet a sad man who has forgotten how to look up, maybe you can show it to him. She knew you wouldn't understand. A profound, soul-crushing wave of understanding washed over Arthur. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a message, a final, desperate attempt to reach him from beyond the grave. She had given the locket away not to spite him, but to save him. She had entrusted her most precious possession, their symbol, to a little girl, hoping that its light would one day find its way back to him, to guide him out of the darkness he had built around himself. He leaned against the wall, the strength draining from his legs. He felt a sob rising in his throat, a raw, primal sound of grief he had suppressed for a year. He fought it back, but the effort was monumental. He looked at Sarah, at this stranger who knew more about his wife's final days than he did. Can I see it? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The locket! Please, I won't take it. I need to see it. Sarah studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his. Then she nodded slowly. Wait here. She slipped back into her apartment, closing the door behind her. Arthur waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. He felt stripped bare, all his wealth and power rendered meaningless. He was just a man, a widower, standing in a hallway, begging for a glimpse of a memory. The door opened. It wasn't Sarah. It was Lily. The little girl stood there, her expression shy and uncertain. She was holding the locket in her outstretched palm. The gold glowed warmly in the dim light of the hallway. She took a tentative step toward him. Mama said you were Ellie's husband, she said. her voice small and clear. "She said you miss her." Arthur couldn't speak. He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. "She was my friend," Lily said. "She gave me this so I wouldn't be sad when she went to go be a star. She said it was magic." She held it up for him to see. It was just as he remembered. Perfect, untarnished. A testament to a love that had endured even his own neglect. "Can I show you something?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking. He reached into his own shirt and pulled out the matching locket, the sun. He opened it, showing her the picture of Eleanor. Lily's eyes grew wide. "That's her! That's Ellie!" she whispered, a look of pure wonder on her face. Arthur's composure finally broke. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a hot path down his cold cheek. He knelt down, so he was on her level. "Yes," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "That's Ellie." Lily looked from the photo in his locket to the locket in her hand. Then she looked at him, a deep, unnerving wisdom in her child's eyes. She stepped forward, and, with a gentleness that shattered him, she placed her locket into his outstretched hand. "You can hold it for a minute," she said softly, "so you won't be sad." He closed his hand around the two pieces of gold, the sun and the moon, finally reunited. They were warm from her touch. He bowed his head, the cold metal pressing into his palm, and for the first time in a year, he truly, completely wept. He wept for Eleanor, for the time he had lost, for the loneliness she must have felt. He wept for his own foolish pride, for the empire he had built on a foundation of absence. He wept for the kindness of a stranger, and the simple, profound grace of a little girl in a dingy hallway in Queens. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the floor, the two lockets clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Lily stood silently beside him, her small presence a comforting anchor in his storm of grief. Sarah watched from the doorway, her arms no longer crossed, her expression one of deep, empathetic sorrow. When the wave of emotion finally subsided, leaving him hollowed out and strangely calm, Arthur slowly got to his feet. He felt a decade older, and paradoxically lighter than he had in years. He opened his hand and looked at the two lockets lying side by side in his palm, the sun and the moon, his and hers. He took a deep, shuddering breath and carefully handed Lily's locket back to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice still raspy. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a street urchin or an obstacle, but as the little girl his wife had adored. "Eleanor, Ellie was right to give it to you. You were a good friend to her." Lily beamed, a proud, gap-toothed smile that was so full of life it almost hurt to look at. She carefully put the locket back on, the gold chain settling against her simple t-shirt. "I have something for you, too," she said. She turned and darted back into the apartment, her small feet pattering on the floor. She returned a moment later, clutching a worn, spiral-bound sketchbook. She held it out to him. "Ellie told me to give this to you if I ever saw you. She said you'd know what to do with it." Arthur took the sketchbook from her. The cover was plain cardboard. He opened it with a sense of trepidation. The pages were filled with pencil drawings. They were extraordinary. Sketches of nurses' hands, tired but gentle. A portrait of an old man sleeping in a chair by a window, the sunlight falling across his face. A detailed drawing of a wilted flower in a glass, every dying petal rendered with heartbreaking precision. And then, page after page of Lily. Lily laughing, her head thrown back. Lily concentrating on a book, her brow furrowed. Lily asleep in a chair, her small chest rising and falling. It was a world of quiet moments, of small beauties, of life persisting in the face of death. It was the world Eleanor had inhabited in her final days. A world she had seen with an artist's eye, a perspective he had been utterly blind to. He had forgotten she could draw like this. It was a talent she had let lie dormant for years, claiming she no longer had the time, that her hands weren't steady enough. But here was the proof, undeniable and powerful. She hadn't stopped being an artist. She had just found a new subject. On the last page was a self-portrait. It was just her face, her eyes staring directly out at him. She was thin, her cheekbones sharp, the illness evident. But there was no self-pity in her gaze. There was only a profound, searching love and a deep, abiding sadness. Beneath the drawing, in her familiar, elegant script, was a single sentence. "Arthur, please, just look up." He closed the book, his knuckles white. It was more than a collection of drawings. It was a map of the territory he had failed to navigate, a guide to the woman he had lost twice, once to his ambition, and then to her illness. I don't know what to say," he stammered, looking at Sarah. "Thank you." "You're not thanking me," she said softly. "You're thanking her." She glanced down the hallway. "I have to get Lily to school, and then I have a shift." It was a gentle dismissal. He had taken enough of their time, of their lives. "Of course," he said, stepping back from the door. "Sarah, what you did for my wife, the friendship you gave her, I can never repay you." He reached for his wallet, an instinctive gesture he immediately regretted. Sarah's eyes hardened instantly. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare cheapen what she and I had by trying to put a price on it. My friendship with Ellie wasn't a service I rendered. It was a gift, for both of us." The rebuke stung, but he knew he deserved it. He was still thinking in his old language, the language of transactions. He needed to learn a new one. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." He looked at the sketchbook in his hands. "Thank you again. For everything." He turned and walked away, down the stairs and out of the building, back into the world of noise and commerce and ambition. But something had fundamentally shifted within him. The city looked different. The people hurrying past him on the sidewalk weren't just obstacles in his path anymore. They were stories, just like Sarah and Lily. They were sons and daughters, husbands and wives. They were all carrying their own sketchbooks, their own lockets, their own griefs and joys. Back in his limousine, the silence felt different. It was no longer the sterile, pressurized silence of isolation. It was a quiet space for reflection. He opened the sketchbook again, poring over each drawing, absorbing the details, trying to see the world through Eleanor's eyes. He saw the compassion in her rendering of a fellow patient, the humor in a sketch of a doctor with a stethoscope tangled in his hair, the deep, overwhelming love in every single line she had used to draw Lily. He had thought her world had shrunk to the four walls of her room, but he was wrong. Her world had expanded. It had opened up to include the small, profound dramas of ordinary life, the very things he had spent his own life trying to rise above. He was the one whose world had shrunk, contracting to the narrow confines of balance sheets and stock prices. He went back to his penthouse, but the opulent space felt cold and alien. It was a museum of a life, not a home. The expensive art on the walls seemed lifeless compared to the vibrant pencil sketches in the book he held. He spent the rest of the day in his study, not working, but reading. He went through Eleanor's old journals, boxes of them he hadn't touched since she died. He read about her dreams of opening a small gallery, a dream he had dismissed as a cute hobby. He read about her volunteer work at a children's art center before his career had demanded they move in social circles where such things were considered quaint but unimportant. He pieced together the portrait of a woman he had lived with for 20 years but had barely known. And he saw his own reflection in her words, the ambitious, driven, brilliant man she had loved, who had slowly, imperceptibly, become a distracted, powerful, lonely stranger. The next day, he didn't go to the office. He sent a single email to Marcus, his partner, and the closest thing he had to a friend. I'm taking a leave of absence, effective immediately. Handle the Fletcher merger. You have my full proxy. Marcus called him instantly, his voice a torrent of panicked questions. Arthur, what the hell is going on? A leave of absence? Now? Fletcher will eat us alive. Let him try, Arthur said, a strange sense of calm settling over him. It's just money, Marcus. Just money? We've spent 5 years on this deal. It's our legacy. No, Arthur said, looking at the sketchbook lying open on his desk. It's not. He ended the call, leaving his partner sputtering in disbelief. He knew what he had to do. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. He was stepping off the path he had so meticulously paved for himself, venturing into an unknown wilderness. And his only guide was a book of pencil drawings and the memory of a conversation in a dingy hallway. His first stop was St. Jude's Hospice. It was a modest, clean building in a quiet, tree-lined street in the Bronx. It was nothing like the gleaming, impersonal medical facility where he had last seen his wife. As he walked through the automatic doors, he was struck by the quiet. It wasn't the sterile, machine-driven quiet of Mount Sinai. It was a peaceful silence, punctuated by the low murmur of conversation and the occasional sound of laughter. A woman at the front desk, a kindly-looking volunteer with a name tag that read Martha, smiled at him. Can I help you, sir? My wife was a patient here, Arthur said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Eleanor Vance. Martha's smile widened. Oh, Ellie, of course. We all remember her. Such a wonderful, brave woman. And that sweet little girl who used to visit her, Lily. A ray of sunshine, that one. Arthur felt a pang in his chest. Here, she wasn't a medical case or a file number. She was Ellie. She was remembered. Is there a garden here? He asked. She mentioned a garden. There is, Martha said, her eyes twinkling. It's our pride and joy. Out the back. Sister Margaret is probably out there now, terrorizing the weeds. He followed her directions, walking down a hallway lined not with abstract corporate art, but with paintings and drawings made by patients and their families. He found the garden. It was small and enclosed, a hidden sanctuary. It wasn't perfectly manicured. It was a riot of color and life, with wildflowers growing alongside roses and herbs filling the air with their scent. A woman in a nun's habit was on her knees, wrestling with a stubborn patch of dandelions. She looked up as he approached, her face weathered and kind. Can I help you? She asked. I'm Arthur Vance, he said. My wife, Eleanor, was here. The nun, Sister Margaret, got to her feet, wiping her dirt-covered hands on her habit. Ah, yes, Ellie. She loved this garden. She used to sit right there, she said, pointing to a simple wooden bench under a willow tree. She would sit there for hours with her sketchbook. Arthur walked over to the bench and sat down. He could almost feel her presence there, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet scratch of her pencil on paper. He could see why she had chosen this place. It was a place to be, not a place to wait for the end. "She talked about you," Sister Margaret said, her voice gentle. "She worried about you." "She had every right to," Arthur said, his voice low. "I wasn't here." "Grief takes many forms, Mr. Vance," the nun said with a wisdom that transcended platitudes. "Sometimes it makes people run. Sometimes it makes them build walls. Your wife understood that. She never judged you. She only loved you." He stayed in that garden for over an hour, talking to Sister Margaret. She told him stories about Eleanor, how she had organized a bad art night for the other patients, how she had taught a young man dying of AIDS how to sketch, how she had insisted on being wheeled out to the garden in the middle of a thunderstorm because she wanted to feel something real. He was learning about a whole lifetime his wife had lived in her last 2 weeks, a life of connection and grace and quiet courage. He left St. Jude's with a profound sense of peace, but also a burning sense of purpose. He knew what Eleanor had meant in her final drawing. Just look up. She wasn't just talking about the sky. She was talking about seeing the world around him, the people, the small moments of beauty he had been blind to for so long. His next stop was a real estate office. He gave the agent the address of Sarah and Lily's apartment building. "I want to buy it," he said. The agent, a slick young man in a tight suit, blinked in surprise. "The whole building, sir?" "Yes," Arthur said. "And I want to do it anonymously, through a holding company. I don't want the tenants to know who their new landlord is." His plan was simple, and in its own way, as strategic as any corporate takeover he had ever orchestrated. He would become their landlord. He would lower their rent. He would fix the leaky pipes and the broken elevator. He would build a small playground in the neglected patch of dirt behind the building. He would give Sarah and Lily a safe, stable place to live, a foundation upon which they could build their lives. It wasn't charity. It was a debt. A debt he owed to the woman and child who had cared for his wife when he had failed to. He also set up a trust, an educational fund for Lily Jennings, enough to cover her schooling from kindergarten through any university she chose, anywhere in the world. He did it all through layers of lawyers and accountants, ensuring his name was never attached. He didn't want their gratitude. He didn't deserve it. He just wanted to do what was right. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized that writing checks from a distance wasn't enough. It was his old way of doing things, throwing money at a problem until it went away. But this wasn't a problem. This was a connection. He found himself thinking about them constantly. He wondered if Lily was enjoying the new swings he'd had installed. He wondered if Sarah was less tired now that she didn't have to worry about the rent. He found himself driving through their neighborhood, parking his car a block away, just hoping for a glimpse of them. It was a strange, almost obsessive behavior, and he knew it. But he couldn't help it. He was drawn to the simple, authentic life they represented, a life that stood in stark contrast to his own empty existence. One afternoon, he saw Lily walking home from school. She was alone, her backpack almost as big as she was. She was kicking a stone along the sidewalk, lost in her own little world. On an impulse he couldn't explain, He got out of the car. "Lily!" he called out. She looked up, and her face broke into that brilliant, gap-toothed smile. "Mr. Art!" she exclaimed, running toward him. It took him a moment to realize she meant him. Mr. Art. He liked the sound of it. It was better than Mr. Vance. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her head tilted curiously. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, the lie feeling clumsy on his tongue. "I wanted to see how you were." "I'm good. We have a new playground. It has a swirly slide," she said, her eyes shining. "And Mama doesn't look so worried anymore." His heart swelled with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It was a potent mixture of satisfaction, relief, and a deep, aching tenderness. "That's wonderful, Lily," he said. "I'm glad to hear that." They stood in an awkward silence for a moment. He was a master of negotiation, a titan of industry, and he had absolutely no idea how to talk to a 7-year-old. "Did you look at the book?" she asked suddenly. "Ellie's book?" "Yes," he said. "I look at it every day." "Is it helping?" she asked, her gaze serious and direct. "Is it helping you not be so sad?" He thought for a moment. Was it? The grief was still there, a hollow ache in his chest that would probably never go away. But it was different now. It was no longer a bitter, angry void. It was a quiet space filled with the memory of her art, her humor, her grace. "Yes, Lily," he said, and he was surprised by the absolute truth of his own words. "It's helping very much." Just then, Sarah came hurrying down the street. "Lily, I told you not to talk to strangers," she called out, her voice sharp with anxiety. Then she saw who Lily was talking to. Her expression shifted from fear to a complicated mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Mr. Vance," she said, her tone guarded, as she reached them and put a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. "What are you doing here?" "He's Mr. Art, Mama," Lily corrected her. Sarah shot him a questioning look. He just shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. "I was in the neighborhood," he repeated, knowing how lame it sounded. "I just wanted to see that you were both all right." Sarah studied him, her gray eyes narrowed. He knew what she must be thinking. Was he stalking them? Was this some new, strange form of harassment? "It's funny," she said, her voice laced with irony. "The day after we met you, our landlord sold the building. The new owner lowered everyone's rent and started fixing the place up. A real anonymous benefactor. So, she suspected. She was smart. Of course she would." "That's a wonderful coincidence," Arthur said, trying to keep his face neutral. She didn't believe him for a second. He could see it in her eyes, but she didn't press the issue. "Well," she said, pulling Lily closer, "we're fine. Thank you for your concern. We should be going." She started to lead Lily away. "Wait," Arthur said, the word coming out before he could stop it. They both turned to look at him. He felt that familiar panic rising, the fear of losing this fragile, unexpected connection. "The sketchbook," he said, grasping for a reason. "Any reason?" "Eleanor's drawings. I was thinking they're too good to be kept in a book on my desk." Sarah waited, her expression patient, curious. "I was thinking they could be a children's book," he continued, the idea forming even as he spoke it. "A story about a little girl and her friend, a woman who goes to become a star. A story about gardens and lockets and looking up at the moon." Lily's eyes grew wide with excitement. "A book? With Ellie's drawings?" Sarah looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he saw the walls around her begin to come down. He saw the artist she might have been, the dreamer buried beneath the tired nurse's scrubs. "I can't write," Arthur admitted, "and I don't know anything about children's books. But I have resources. I could hire the best writers, the best publishers." "No," Sarah said softly, but with a firm, quiet authority. "You wouldn't hire anyone. Ellie wouldn't want that." She looked down at her daughter, and then back at him, a slow, hesitant smile spreading across her face. "Lily would tell the story, and I would write it down." It was a breathtakingly simple, impossibly perfect idea. A collaboration, a partnership, a way to keep Eleanor's memory alive, not as a monument to grief, but as a living, breathing story of love and friendship. "Yes," Arthur said, his heart feeling so full he thought it might burst. "Yes, that's exactly what we'll do." They stood on that cracked city sidewalk, a grieving billionaire, a weary nurse, and a little girl with a magic locket, the three of them bound together by the ghost of a woman who had loved them all. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Arthur looked up, really looked up, and for the first time in a very long time, he thought it was beautiful. He was finally learning to see both the sun and the moon.